In this video, we will see two important authors for realist theory in international relations, Carr and Morgenthau. In the 20th century, there is a relevant difference that must be noted. The academia begins to reflect about war. Topics about diplomacy and war were formerly discussed between diplomats and the military. When academia begins to participate, it creates a discussion over the necessity of producing scientific knowledge about international relations. At this moment, we had a different view of science. Carr thinks about science within a polarity between utopia and reality. He tries to show that it is not possible to intervene in society without building models on this reality. We develop mental patterns to understand the reality we interact with. For Carr, it is essential that reality should come first. The function of a set of principles and values is to be functional within a reality that they can fit. In this, order fulfills its role when it adjusts to the properties it had previously observed. This ceases to happen due to the transformations of the beginning of the 20th century. In the 19th century, there was a British hegemony and a strong influence of liberal thought. Liberalism can rule the world efficiently because the British Navy guarantees the free movement of products, it frees slaves, and open ports by force. As there is an organicity between material power and the idea, we have this presumption that it works in a coherent way. Coherence is in the fit between the reality model and the reality that supports the model. About utopia, these models that we created to deal with reality have a practical aspect. International thought has a fundamental order, which is the international order. Its value is in the stability it provides for that political structure. For Carr, to understand the failure of the 20th century, it is necessary to understand the success of the 19th century. The success of the 19th century was that the hegemonic process worked so well that it created an order so fluid that it seemed like the only order possible, with principles and values that could be applied to any world. Carr argues that this is not how it works. The relationship between utopia and reality does not work that way. Utopia works as it adapts to reality. When order and principles accommodate a given reality, we create stability in the system with a degree of diversity. Stability provides the possibility for prosperity. The prosperity of the 19th century is the product of a power juncture. This utopia needs this reality to function. Carr seeks to show that reality has changed and that utopia no longer fits. There is no alternative utopia at that moment to stabilize the system. This is the tragedy of the 20th century. The international system is unable to think of a power project that gives legitimacy to a new international situation, and the only alternative utopia at that time was a socialist one. The material condition of the world has changed, and there is an inability of those responsible for decision-making to think of a new set of principles that suit this new reality. This is important because Carr is misunderstood. Some interpret it as if he criticizes the concept of utopia, but that is not what he is telling you, because there is no stability without utopia. We need order. The problem is not utopia, but rather using a utopia that does not fit the 20th century. States are broken and cannot structure themselves. At the end of the Second World War, as part of the lessons learned, they create financial institutions to support the rebuilding of these economies, because if they don't rebuild, they won't be able to enter the free trade system. Thus, the idea of liberalism, which flourished in the 19th century, is not effective in the new century. The idea is that society has been transformed, and the utopia that organized society properly in the past century is no longer capable of fulfilling this role in the new century. It is an acknowledgement that we need order in the context between wars. The absence of this order is what generates the chain of events that breaks out in the Second World War. Morgenthau seeks to show the principles of political realism. What do we need to know to understand how the power game works? First, it would be necessary to understand the relationship between human nature and the political game. We have the influence of Hobbes' human nature on how selfish it is, and therefore no agreement is permanent and war is always a possibility. He tries to show that international political science is based on objective principles that have as a fundamental background the specific understanding of human nature. This differs the realist tradition from other forms of thinking. It does not mean that we don't have agreements or that they do not work. It means that even when we are building agreements, we have to prepare for the possibility of them being broken. The author assumes that human nature is marked by this element of the disposition to place individual interest above collective interest in any circumstances, and therefore this can always be a possibility. This is the first fundamental element. the idea that human nature is selfish, and because it is selfish, war must always be considered a possibility. From the statesman's point of view, the most irresponsible thing you can do is not to be prepared for the possibility of war. The second principle of political realism is the idea of interest defined in terms of power. Like Carr, he seeks to systematize academic knowledge of international politics. He wants to translate international politics into basic principles and systematize that reflection. For him, for international political science to be an area of study, we must work with the idea that each sphere of the social world has its own rationality. We need to understand the rationality of politics in order to develop a reflection of international politics. Every economic decision can be evaluated in terms of its rationality. To understand decision-making, it is necessary to understand the political rationality behind the decision, however complex it may be. So, many important decisions have an economic, technical, and political rationality. We have the idea of human nature guiding our perception of the instability of any normative institutional arrangement, and the permanent presence of the possibility of war. We have to make decisions based on this premise. Even if we are in a stable world today, it may not be stable tomorrow. We have the idea of interest in terms of power. In order to reflect on the political reality, we have to understand that state decisions must be understood from their political consequences and not only from the technical and economic consequences. Third, we have the idea that power is not fixed. This means that what counts as power varies from one context to another. What is a strategic resource in a given region is not strategic for another. There are places that come into conflict because of water reserves, but that is not the reality in Brazil, for instance. In Brazil, water resources do not fulfill the same functions from the point of view of power dynamics and state decisions in the country. The fourth point is the relationship between morality and power. How do we choose the ethical principles that will govern the political decision-making process? Like Machiavelli, he is concerned with the decision-making process. What matters is building the knowledge that will help you play the game of international chess, not only from the standpoint of setting the rules, but from the standpoint of allowing you to recognize what the correct and the wrong moves are. From the point of view of the relationship between morality and power, the morality of the private sphere is the morality of religion, of the family. It is the idea that I make choices from the point of view of my ethics. The way I conduct myself in the world, the consequences of the choices I make, it is I who suffer. As I am fundamentally the person who suffers the consequences of the choices I make, the principles that are the foundation of my decisions are based on the principles of individual ethics. The problem is when you are a statesman because the consequences of the decisions you make are imposed on everyone you represent. In this scenario, the ethics that work is not the ethics of conviction, but the ethics of responsibility that you have for those you represent. In this situation, the ethics of belief is not an adequate guide. The ethics of responsibility is the principle that guides the decision of a person who is in a position where the consequences of the choices you make are imposed not only on you, but also on more people. So, my responsibility should be what guides decision-making. As a statesman, he is committed to guiding his decision based on the ethics of collective responsibility versus the ethics of individual conviction. So, in this, we have this relationship between morality and power, which is the fourth principle. The fifth is the danger of presumption of moral superiority. As a society, there is a tendency to think that your conception of the good, the values that guide your society, is inherently superior because it is the element of your own society. The problem is that when you can't understand that the other's culture is so fundamentally different, the value hierarchies you build for yourself don't necessarily work in the other society. This can lead to political decisions of a wrong nature. The last principle is the idea of the autonomy of the political sphere. It is an attempt to establish international politics as an autonomous field of activity. For example, we cannot confuse political rationality with economic rationality. For him, political rationality and economic rationality has its own dynamics and its own cost and benefit calculation. It is important to understand the autonomy of the political sphere because in the scope of international politics, what is at stake is the sovereignty of the state. Because of this, the inability to play the game of international politics can result in the extermination of the political community. Thus, because what is at stake has a lot of value, having the ability to understand the specific rationality of that field of action is very important. That's all. Thank you for watching.